Hi everybody, this is Let's Talk About Shame from the 2022 Plural Positivity World Conference. Shame is not talked about enough in our society. It's barely mentioned in most mainstream treatment books. It's shoved under a rock in our culture and is not talked about openly enough in support groups. People mention shame in passing, but then are ashamed of being ashamed. So there's little community wisdom about how to handle it or heal it. Some experts even say that dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID, may be a shame-based disorder. It's certainly one of the top stumbling blocks for most traumagenic systems, and unfortunately, some therapists may increase a client's shame rather than help them deal with it. Let's talk about shame. Normal shame versus toxic and carried shame. How shame presents in plural systems, signs that we have been shame triggered, and how we can start dumping toxic and carried shame and experience normal or healthy shame appropriately. We are the Crisses, content creator, life coach, and website administrator for several plural and DID focused websites. This is a talk for all plural DID and OSDD systems who think that shame, procrastination, perfectionism, addiction, self-harm, denial, intrusive behavior, and other issues may play a role in their collective life. It's also for our allies, partners, and those who support us in community so that they can perhaps understand their own shame as well. Where some have proposed that DID may be a shame-based disorder, others say it's a trauma-based disorder. Maybe it's both. Today, we will put shame into perspective and not only focus on the toxic or maladaptive version. Shame is a normal, highly adaptive emotion with a purpose. We want to talk about shame and definitely need to take corrective actions regarding maladaptive versions of shame, but we don't want to get rid of all shame. Unfortunately, feelings have been moralized into good and bad feelings. Feelings are just feelings. They're neither good nor bad in themselves. What we do with them is important, and whether they're warranted in the first place can be vital because emotions come with metabolic consequences. Emotions flood our body with chemicals and can affect our physical metabolism, and they also flood our system when we don't have appropriate internal boundaries and can affect our headmates and our emotional and mental equilibrium. Most emotions can be roughly partitioned into love-related emotions and fear-related emotions. Either we're drawn toward something by the emotion or repulsed away from it in some way. Shame is a fear-based emotion. It causes repulsion away from specific types of social interactions, and when it's internalized, we can even be repulsed from ourselves. We're going to talk about why we feel shame, what the productive version of shame does for us, and how toxic and carried shame burdens and blocks survivors of abuse and neglect from making the most of our life. We're also going to discuss the individualistic form of shame, not a collectivistic form, such as they have brought shame on their family. So the versions of shame we're discussing here are developmental, but also colored by cultural expectations. The biology behind shame and its development in itself is similar across all of humanity, but as shame also has relational and cultural components, what triggers shame and how we internalize it varies by external context. Shame can get very complicated. There's also potential intergenerational issues in some toxic shame scenarios, exploitation of shame, and, ironically, shaming people into silence about shame. Due to the nature of shame and this talk, we're going to say we and our a lot. We've decided it's best to talk about ourselves and allow listeners to decide whether they're included in the we or not included. The few points where we say you, if we don't make any flubs along the way, are pretty carefully chosen. So who talks about shame? Shame is barely talked about in much of the clinical documentation for treating DID. It gets a half page in Frank Putnam's 1989 landmark book on treating MPD. The word is mentioned 6 times in the ISSTD 2011 Adult Treatment Guidelines, mostly in lists of other emotions and with no specific notes on treating shame in DID. However, Pia Mellody, in the 1989 book Facing Codependence, has talked about it extensively. But she's not a therapist. She works in the addiction treatment and recovery field and was noticing a pattern in the people around addicts that their codependent partners all had something in common. They were all abused or neglected as children. Mellody went into great detail about shame cycles and how she viewed shame. The book is a veritable catalog of neglect and abuse issues, the likes of which you won't find in most recovery literature. We would only suggest it as an adjunct to trauma work, but her brave work has strongly informed our own thoughts about shame and how to handle it. Then there's Patricia DeYoung's book, Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame, Healing Right Brain Relational Trauma from 2015 and the revised 2022 version hot off the presses. DeYoung is a relational psychotherapist in Canada, so this book frames shame in terms of relational psychotherapy and includes a chapter on shame and dissociation. This is an excellent and dense work. It will take us a while to get through fully, but talking about shame can't wait. Neither of these works concentrates on shame and plurality. Shame almost always includes parts work, though, whether singular or plural. We've actually pulled together a bunch of different resources to come up with what we're talking about here, between working on culture and belongingness in our online courses, with research into positive psychology, community, and more, but strongly leaning on a blend of Pia Mellody's work and social self-preservation theory. Shame is what we feel when our belongingness is threatened, when we don't measure up to the standards and expectations of a community that we need or wish to belong to. Shame monitors threats to belongingness. We feel shame when we feel that we might be violating the rules and the agreements of a culture such that we might get ourselves exiled, pushed out, or publicly humiliated. Belongingness is a Maslow hierarchy need. It's the third tier up, the first one being physical safety and security, the second one being getting our physical needs met, such as our need for food, clothing, and shelter. Right above that is our need for love and belongingness. Shame also shows up in feelings of embarrassment, and sometimes we'll actually get a visible flush on the face so that other people can see how contrite we are and that we really mean it when we say we're sorry. Shame usually stems from when you think you will be judged when you make a mistake, most especially when considering being witnessed or found out for making a mistake and judged for it. Shame promotes humility. Allowing ourselves to experience the adaptive version of shame is a cornerstone of self-editing and thinking twice before making an error or revealing a secret. Shame keeps people humble, reminding us that we're fallible and that being imperfect is okay. Embarrassment is the form shame takes when the actual witnessing happens. So a person making a mistake when totally alone is one thing. If they think someone might find out that they made a mistake, they might feel shame and try to mask or hide the mistake. But someone making a mistake when there are witnesses is embarrassing. Embarrassment is a form of shame because they think someone else might judge them in some way for what happened. Guilt is far more internal. Where guilt judges our behavior based on internal standards, shame holds up our behavior against external standards. I may feel guilty about a mistake because I wasted time or materials, but I might not admit to having made the mistake to others out of shame. And I might be petrified of making mistakes in front of others because it would be embarrassing. Shame is possibly one of the first introspective emotions that a child has, and comes from disapproval from external attachments. The basic instinct is that we need approval to remain a member of our family, clan, or tribe, and that if we lose that approval, we may be exiled, shunned, or expunged from the group that we are dependent or interdependent on for survival. Shame is very much enforced by external folk onto a child, usually caregivers, but this also means it could be nearly any trusted member of the clan. And in its normal form, shame reinforces safety, like a young child running into the street, finding out they made a mistake, may be ashamed of themselves for being so careless. And it also reinforces belongingness in kind of a perverse way, so that we don't violate the culture and be exiled. When used for control of a young child's behavior, it's a type of ego attack, but with good attachment parenting, the parent reinforces love to help heal the smack of shame. It's like the wake up, this is serious, and I still love you. The problems occur when the shame is not healed after, or shaming is used for power and control in ways that are not to reinforce safety or belonging in the culture and tribe. Shame develops at an age that children begin to wander away from caregivers, and before they can introspect and predict the results of their actions. Shame's important because children at this age don't know all the rules, or they haven't yet developed self-control. The risk of disapproval from shame helps them learn to think before they act. Developmentally, this dynamic allows caregivers to exert verbal and emotional control over or disempower young children and stop them in their tracks to keep them safe. Anytime we use shame this way, it should be followed by comforting and reassuring a child that the relationship is okay and that their belongingness is assured in spite of their mistake. This is thought to heal the bruised ego and resolve the potential shame and social threat implied by triggering shame in children. This use of shame to shape children's behavior may sound bad on the surface, but it's also thought that if parents are too permissive and never redirect a child from wandering off, the children will put themselves in danger, break social rules, and so on, but it may also cause other developmental issues where a person breaks social conventions and rules in other harmful ways. It's a delicate balance, and shame plays a role in development whether it's handled well or not. So thus, as we grow up, this normal shame helps us know in advance when something we're thinking about might break social conventions or get us in trouble, and helps us think twice before doing something. The shame itself is experienced in terms of embarrassment if we're found out to have broken a social agreement or rule, or witnessed while making a mistake. One thing about normal shame is that it's usually quite temporary. We think about doing something, consider, what if I'm found out, feel shame about it, and then we don't do the thing and the feeling of shame goes away. Or we make a mistake and are worried someone might find out, we feel shame, and either we fix the mistake best we can, or face the shame and admit the mistake, and then work to repair the relationships if necessary. Sometimes our shame in these cases is misplaced. The people we thought might be upset about what happened aren't. Or they forgive us for our mistake and we all move on. This is normal shame, though. As traumatized people, even normal shame can have a triggering effect on our system and trigger shame cycles, a form of emotional flashbacks and reenactments. One form of maladaptive shame, which we call toxic shame, comes from caregivers' misuse of shame's developmental power dynamic to control and disempower children without healing the relationship, and the child's social standing afterwards. Melody didn't talk about this particular dynamic as much as carried shame, which we'll get to shortly. Usually, toxic shame is a pretty explicit form of abuse as things go. Verbal abuse, accusations, shifting blame, and so on. It's not easy to deal with, just like any other shame, but it's easier to point a finger to because the signs are more overt. There are subtleties involved, and a book like Toxic Parents and Community Support is more readily available to help with folks struggling with toxic shame issues. Toxic shame may rear its head in negative self-talk, self-blame, and anxiety about doing things that one might be outcast, blamed, or called out for. Usually, toxic shame comes with explicit messages, thoughts, and verbalizations. A little warning, these messages are not about anyone in particular, and we're not going to phrase any examples of how these messages may appear in the wild. But we do want to caution your system to make sure a verbal protector is nearby to make sure that y'all can hear what we say safely. In cases of toxic shame, a victim has been told there's something wrong about them. They have been told that they are, by their very nature, unacceptable. This is an aggressive and abusive form of humiliation in an attempt to gain power and control over a despondent victim. It is purposeful, toxic, and deliberately used to make someone feel small and disempowered. These perps are insidious, and it's a form of verbal abuse and violation. The messages can be haunting, and they undermine confidence long past when the attacks happened. Victims with any other issues with boundaries or processing shame can have a lot of trouble letting go of these messages. They're a form of gaslighting, they're falsehoods, and they undermine reality. So to be 100% clear, we're talking to everyone, even the people in the back of the room or the back of your head. We are all acceptable. We are all right, as we are, with the possibility of change within a range of our ability if we choose it, and we are all valid and worthy of attention. Our nature in itself is not a problem. When a victim has been humiliated or handed toxic shame, in other words, sometimes they can't let go of these messages. The messages show up in different forms in their mind and color their behavior and prevent them from being able to take action because they're so afraid that they'll be berated for it. We can usually tell if we're experiencing toxic shame because it's usually full of chatter and messages, and it tends to feed on itself, spiraling into tighter, constricting cycles unless we can break out of it. It can be very helpful to notice and name a toxic shame cycle for what it is. This is shame. This is from bad messages we got from other people. This is not our own messages to ourselves. We've been handed this. Toxic shame and normal shame both may serve as triggers for much more entrenched toxic forms of shame, and that's where carried shame comes into the picture. We'll talk more about some other faces of shame in a bit. When we talk about carried shame, we're talking about stopping cycles of trauma and abuse. So first we have to address the mechanisms by which shame is passed from one person to another. Carried shame is shame we have introjected from another person. It actually is not our own shame, it's misplaced. This is a cyclical issue, basically a type of psychic contagion, so it's hard to figure out where in the process to begin to describe it. So, as we've already set the stage for talking about the child, let's start with the child's experience and role in the process. Infants are born completely helpless and without boundaries, and also entirely dependent on caregivers. As a child develops, they will mimic and absorb cues from their environment and the people around them that help them learn how to be in the world. So basically, everything around a child is a role model of sorts. Either a child decides to emulate what's around them or interact with it, or avoid it. A proper caregiver defends the child, and the child learns they are worth protecting, which is the start of a child learning how to have and defend their own boundaries. When a child is given love and attention, they learn they are worthy of love and attention. They learn to hold themselves higher in regard to others. However, caregivers are imperfect people. No one is perfect. And sometimes a person makes a mistake. How the caregiver responds when they make a mistake with their child can affect how the child handles their own mistakes, or can impact the child in many ways, seeing as how the caregiver is a role model. In terms of abuse, it's not even a mistake. A caregiver may violate boundaries, exercise power and control over the child. In either case, whether a mistake or more purposeful, the caregiver ought to be ashamed of their handling of the child, but now it becomes far more complicated. The child is observing this behavior. This caregiver is a role model, even if they're not ideal, and the child absorbs their behavior, either adopting it or reacting to it. We're going to use parts language because we can't assume the caregiver is fully multiple, but even singular folk have parts. The caregiver has a part of them that's ashamed of their interaction with the child, but often they have their own issues with shame and cover it up somehow. A shameholder part wants to hide and be small, invisible. In addition, often people have a part that compensates or covers up shame, especially people who were abused themselves, and we'll see why in a moment. So the caregiver can't fully acknowledge what's happening, makes up whatever reality in their head that works for them, given their own issues, but they have the child as a witness of what they've done. The nature of shame is about mistakes being witnessed and threats to belonging. The caregiver doesn't want anyone to find out, often even the child, regarding what has happened. The part that compensates, whom we shall call the shame defender, gets triggered, and their job is covering up shame. The shame defender is triggered when the shame part reaches a threshold of activation. So generally speaking, depending on how strongly the shame is triggered, the shame defender overcompensates for it and attempts to deflect anything shameful away so that the shame holder can become untriggered. So, a word of warning, even moderate shame can be covered up with vehement denial, an ego collapse, a wide variety of misdirection, blame, or even violence. The child, with their lack of boundaries, even and especially on an emotional level, is like a raw empath, an open radio receiver for this emotional groundswell in the caregiver. The shame is not lost on a child, even though the caregiver has parts trying to cover it up. But the child cannot tell that the caregiver's shame is not their own. They usually don't know why they're experiencing this intense shame. They feel small, invisible, like they want to hide, and they know something is wrong. They may also witness the simultaneous acting out of the shame defender part. The juxtaposition of these conflicting messages and urges serves to confuse the child, who is likely totally dependent on this caregiver, even if only for a short time. And the child may absorb or interject both the shame, but is carried shame, and interject the behavior of the shame defender in some way. This is one way to handle shame, is the strong message received. Carried shame is the interjected shame from someone who is repressing their own shame. We can tell it apart from normal shame because normal shame is, I've done something wrong, where carried shame holds the message, there's something wrong with me. When we feel that intense shame from someone overtly denying and covering up their shame, we don't know where it's coming from consciously. We only know we didn't do anything, but this person is intensely angry or agitated or violent towards us, and we're getting flooded with the repressed shame at the same time. The only way for the child to sort it out is to think there must be something so wrong with them, that they don't belong, that they're somehow different, that they're unworthy of normal regard for children. Rather than being ashamed of something they did, They become ashamed about who and what they are. So when that child has carried shame and later on maybe apologizes too much and someone tells them they didn't do anything wrong, it doesn't help. If anything, often that can be triggering in itself. No, this person thinks, I didn't do anything wrong. There's something wrong with me, and I don't deserve to be treated with normal regard. So we want to make a sidebar here and take this out of the theoretical for just a few moments. We aren't talking about you, but we're certain many people listening think we are. So we want to say that you're valid. You're so not alone. Right now, you're surrounded by people attending this presentation who feel exactly the same way, all of whom have something in common, this carried shame issue. Someone has done you wrong, presented you with this conflict, you probably internalized it. You are unfortunately in very good company, and you belong here. You're amongst friends and like-minded people who also have these issues. You're very much not alone. And we'll talk more about this. But if you identify with this, we want you to know that the caregiver ought to have felt their shame, ought to be ashamed of how they behaved with a child, and you can choose to put that shame outside of yourselves because it's not yours. Whether it goes back to the person it belonged to or whether you dump it in a way that it's gone forever, it's important to offload carried shame. However, that's not pushing the shameholder or the shame defender of your system out. That's a separate issue. They desperately need help, but they may be so buried and triggered they don't know it. So back to the totally theoretical case that is not you, even though you may identify with some of what we're saying. A child with a carried shame history hopefully grows up to be an adult one day, and in our society that doesn't acknowledge shame, they're likely still carrying this shame with them. They also probably have interjected some form of shame defender of their own, with its own repertoire of defenses to compensate for shame. After all, they learned how to do that when they were a kid. This totally theoretical person may become a caregiver for a child one day, even if only briefly, and they are only human, so they may make a mistake, and they ought to be ashamed, and are, but anytime they feel shame, it's likely their shameholder part gets triggered. And if there's sufficient shame in what happened, their shame defender also gets triggered. The child witnesses this and takes it on, and it becomes their own shame issues going forward. This, then, can become intergenerational issues. Sometimes we can't point to the generation where it started, but we do know that carried shame can be passed from generation to generation. It also can be someone outside the family unit that transfers carried shame into a family. These issues can come with direct blame, or they can come with more collectivistic features such as shame on the whole family or clan, but we're more familiar with individualism than collectivism given our own cultural upbringing. In some cases, a chain of carried shame has become collectively codified in a family culture, and carried shame can be seen in some religious teachings and in the history of how children were treated legally around the world. Breaking the chain of carried shame is very important, and hopefully that starts by talking about shame, teaching each other about shame, and giving each other permission to dump carried and toxic shame as the unwanted and unneeded baggage it is. Before we go on, we want to say that we, speaking about us as the Crisses, can't change mistakes we've made as an adult. We have parental guilt, and we had moments where we could have been a better parent ourselves. It's important to be big enough to acknowledge it, admit it to our kids, own it, and not get buried by the shame of it. The shame will make us shrink and be small and avoid things, and what our kids need from us now is not to make it about us, to offer to tell them what happened, to be honest, and to help them process the consequences. So we have both to deal with the shame handed to us, the carried shame from prior generations, and offload it, but also to do our best not to pass any more of it onto our kids than we may already have. We have to move on from where we are now. Moderating our guilt is important so it doesn't hold us back from progress, and monitoring shame so that it serves to keep us from making more mistakes without dragging us down into an inescapable pit. So, this is the important stuff. When we have shame, what do we do with it? What type of shame is it? And how do we get to as healthy a place as possible from here? Toxic and chronic carried shame needs to be yeeted. If we think about childhood trauma, we were a kid then, unable to provide for ourselves, unable to defend ourselves, and often we didn't even know whether something was right or wrong, or have the ability or access to control our environment and circumstances. That's all on our caregivers when we were kids. That was their job. The shame from abuse and trauma where our caregivers violated the social contract of how to care for children needs to belong to those who violated that social contract. We have choices of how to dump the shame. We can send it back to those who did the wrongs, the adults way back when. Shame on them for taking advantage of someone who is helpless, dependent, innocent, a child, etc. Shame on them for not fulfilling the social and necessary responsibilities of a child's caregiver. At the same time, if we take this idea too literally, it can also present issues. We shouldn't expose ourselves to re-traumatization or chance triggering our former abusers or caregivers, shameholders, or shame defenders, or put ourselves at risk, so we don't want to make a verbal or face-to-face confrontation about this. Basically, confronting our perps can hand them some of our power or control back, so we don't recommend that anyone seek them out or confront them. It's likely they would dodge, deny, gaslight, or get angry. Even if they don't, it's not likely that we get any satisfaction from the confrontation with anyone who was actively abusive. However, we do still need to dump this carried or toxic shame. It's not ours. It's not about us. It's their BS poured on an innocent child. Our own denial can get in the way of dumping toxic and carried shame. We still might believe we deserve it somehow. But when we spend time with other people and their stories of carried shame from childhood, or when we watch children growing up from completely helpless infants, we can clearly see how a child is clueless and defenseless, and how caregivers can be way out of line. The same applies to each of us listening, and the fact is that what happened to us as a child happened to an innocent person, and our caregivers were out of line and poured their BS on us when we were an innocent child. So society has come up with many ways to dump toxic and carried shame, but we don't always recognize those techniques for what they really are. It takes on many other disguises in the world. Write messages on scraps of paper and have a little burn party. And please exercise proper safety precautions and don't get hurt doing it. Maybe write things on scraps of toilet paper and flush them down the toilet. Or write things with graphite pencil on leaves and let them wash downstream. Put all the messages outside of your body and let them go away from you somehow. Get them out. In many cultures, there are toxic attachment dumping rituals, forms of letting things go that can easily be adapted for this. You can picture collecting the shame in your inner world and immolating it, dumping it into an ocean or body of water to be carried away, launching it into space, zapping it with an obliteration spell, and so on. Any form of yeet, offloading ballast, dumping. You might discover more sneaky shame in the future, but the same tactics can be employed. Recognizing that it's not yours, that you took on misplaced shame from someone else, and get rid of it in any visceral and real way you can imagine or act out. For toxic shame, you can write the messages that people handed you that get repeated or twisted in your own head. For carried shame, you can write about how your perps should be ashamed of how they treated children or how they treated y'all. And keep talking about shame. Help others yeet their shame messages and the shame they carry that belongs to someone else. When you're helping someone who has these impossibly heavy feelings and feels like they're not worthy and is struggling to carry this burden, help them release that baggage. Figure out how they can dump these toxic feelings they carry with them from being a victim of someone who wouldn't own the BS they were pulling. And then, even though you may have dumped some of your own already, always reflect back on your own situation and check whether there's more shame to offload. In terms of shame and plurality, we have some tips and reminders. Of course, since we are plural or have DID, our shameholder and shame defender parts can show up as full headmates of any type, parts, or people, rather than less distinct parts in the singular sense. Shameholders are usually extremely deep within one system, though that's not a rule, just a guideline. Shame defenders can be rebels, persecutors, guardians, or defenders, easily enraged, or they can act out in many ways to try to deflect shame from the shameholder. These are usually difficult headmates to work with, and we suggest mitigating shame issues by dumping shame and learning what shame triggers may be at play in our system. There's a potential for a combination of both toxic and carried shame, where internal persecutors set off shameholders and shame defenders get set off because the shameholder is triggered. Or even where the persecutor is also the shame defender and an emotional feedback loop or flashback loop occurs where they set each other off in a bad way. The co-conscious folk in our system, those able to work together and plan, can help analyze our shared life for shame triggers, the names that we use for each other, how we discuss each other's behavior, who we expose ourselves to, how people around us talk about us or our system, and so on. When we analyze past crisis points, we can look for shame triggers in what was happening when the crisis first got triggered. Did someone say we should be doing something differently? Did someone criticize a mistake? Did someone attack our character? Or even just point out that we were wrong about something in a way that set us off? Often people think they're being helpful, but they frame their help and advice in ways that lean on shame to get us to act the way they wish us to. These can be folded into our society in ways that most people don't notice, but can be devastating to someone with toxic or carried shame issues and set off shame cycles for their system. We also recommend discussing shame with safe people, such as a treatment team. It's a complicated topic, and we do our best to approach it with the attitude that we are imperfect, but working on getting better and better all the time. Shame issues are a major milestone to approach and work through, and as survivors, we will get through this. As we learn more and more about shame, we can uncover the many faces that shame appears in. It appears in procrastination, perfectionism, stage fright, social phobias, self-harm, addiction, depression, denial, and internalized ableism. A quick definition of internalized ableism is our internalized expectations of what we are actually able to do, how hard we push ourselves and hurt ourselves thinking we can push through something, or that we can sacrifice self-care to have the time or spoons to do something at the price of our future well-being. We are ashamed to be disabled and push ourselves beyond what is wise, even though it may further disable us. It is never about externalized ableism. Internalized ableism is something we only do to ourselves. We can tell everyone else they're pushing themselves too hard. It's okay to use assistive technology, remind people of self-care, etc., but still be in denial about what we're doing to ourselves. It's a little more complicated in plurality because we're group entities. So is it internalized ableism or just ableism when it occurs between headmates? But because of myopia, things too close to us being distorted, we're still going to call it internalized ableism when it happens only within the plural system. Perfectionism and procrastination are so common that they deserve some airtime as well. Perfectionism is a form of hypervigilance about not meeting the external expectations of a project or commitment. We Crisses are petrified about losing face or disappointing someone, being late, or making mistakes that we might be called out on. So we expend enormous spoons on self-oversight, hyper-focus on meeting expectations or timing, and so on, definitely beyond that which the project actually calls for. We would never expect someone else to be omniscient and omnipotent, but here we are expecting it from ourselves. We aren't perfect, period. We make mistakes, we're fallible. Once we fully embrace that, we can correct ourselves, and once we pledge to learn from our mistakes and do our best not to repeat them, maybe we can start to relax from that perfectionism some. We know life is hard and life is not fair. We don't have control over all the factors of our project's success, so sometimes we have to own mistakes and do our best to keep moving on and realize that others are making mistakes around us too. Procrastination can be a form of perfectionism, where a person is so worried about falling short of expectations that they can't even start. They're immobilized by the enormity of the project or the expectations or how vital it is to get it right, and sometimes they need the added anxiety of a looming deadline to finally motivate themselves to get started. Similar to perfectionism, there's still the fear of failure, falling short of the mark, being unable to meet expectations, of being humiliated or disappointing others. In both cases, there's often a shame component involved. The fear of others knowing that we're flawed, imperfect, the fear of letting others down, of social consequences for our mistakes. Sometimes there's more than one issue causing a shame reaction, and we're caught in the middle of conflicting shame issues, which is likely where the procrastination takes hold. Ashamed of not being able to start, afraid of the consequences of potential mistakes, we get caught in an emotional catch-22. In addition to dumping toxic or carried shame, it can be helpful to acknowledge that not only are we not perfect, but it's usually okay to be imperfect as well. We can be terrified of making mistakes, but usually that's because an asshole abuser punished a child for just being a fallible person. If we are understanding about others making mistakes and being imperfect, maybe we can internalize that it's okay for us too. It's also possible to let others who care about us know that we're afraid of letting them down and making mistakes, and with an honest discussion of our shame around procrastination or perfectionism, perhaps we can resolve that this project in question is not going to threaten our relationship with them so that our fears can be laid to rest. Maybe. Consider this a work in progress. It can take time to work through these issues. This presentation also touches on topics and issues that dovetail into our other presentation on belongingness. These topics are interrelated. Shame, as we said at the start, monitors threats to belongingness. It warns us that something we are contemplating or something we have done, a mistake we have made, may threaten our stance in the community. So discussions about how our communities are set up, how our communities handle shame and belongingness, or trigger shame by way of exiling community members, or use shame to control community member behavior, is also important. Shame in many forms, whether purely internalized or whether reinforced by the communities we create, steals a lot of spoons from our community. It's not helped by a world that takes advantage of the shame in our community to oppress, silence, and manipulate us. Someone recently asked why there's so many pride movements in the United States. It's because we cultivate so much shame in our population. Shame is used to control the masses, and unfortunately, specific plural and D communities may be built around principles that activate toxic or carried shame. So that brings us full circle to our other presentation. We hope this has been informative to all of y'all, and that we have given y'all something to think about, some action items to work on, and ways to spot and handle shame. It's our hope that all our communities will be talking more and more about shame for plurals and traumagenic systems. We will, throughout our works. This isn't a one-and-done topic. It's going to come back with more nuance, more specifics, again and again. Please take great care of yourselves, and thank you.